This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. The most recent book in the series is Animal Activism on and Off the Screen, edited by Claire Parkinson and Lara Henning. If you haven't already, do go and check out my recent conversation with Claire about the book. It was released last month on Knowing Animals. Now today is one of our unusual double guest episodes, and both guests, as it happens, are people I've known for many years. Dr. Eze Paez is a returning guest. He first appeared on the podcast back in 2018. Eze is a Tenure-Track Professor in Jurisprudence and Bioethics at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. He works on questions in moral and political philosophy and is perhaps best known for his work on wild animal suffering and animals in republican political theory. Welcome to the podcast, Eze.
Hello, Josh, and pleasure to be here.
Now, my second guest is Dr. Pablo Magaña. He's a new guest. Pablo is an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow at Trinity College Dublin. He's a political philosopher with particular interests in questions about animals in democratic theory. Welcome to the podcast, Pablo.
No, thank you very much.
Today we're going to talk about a paper that Eze and Pablo co-authored, and that's Sentientist Political Liberalism. This paper was published open access in the Pacific Philosophical Quarterly in 2026. So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Actually, I'd been interested in the topic of how animals fit in political liberalism or roles in political liberalism since I first started working in animal ethics about 11 years ago. But I set aside those questions of political philosophy back then to work on more foundational issues about wild animal suffering. And it was only after engaging again with political philosophy through my work on republicanism, which you just mentioned, and animals, that I felt somewhat unsatisfied about existing takes on how theories of political legitimacy, public justification, and so on have to be changed if we recognize animals have political standing and are subjects of justice. And by that time, Pablo and I had already worked together in a number of projects. I think he's a leading scholar on animals and democratic theory. So I pitched this idea to him.
So in my case, it was a very similar story, which at the end kind of converged. So I was writing my PhD thesis on the representation of animals, and I had this chapter on legitimacy that I couldn't include in the thesis, but I had spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around public justification, political legitimacy, and animals, and I was similarly insatisfied. So I think it was in October 2021, there was a Congress on roles in a city like north of Barcelona, in Girona, and Eze and I said, well, we both have these worries about how to integrate animals within roles and more generally political liberalism. So why don't we try to sit down and write some ideas and let's see what comes up.
Great. So one obvious thing, both of you were talking about roles. And I know who Rawls is. I spend a lot of time dealing with Rawlsian philosophy. But I guess a lot of listeners and a lot of people in the animal studies world might not really be familiar with who he is. So one of the things we really need to do to get to the bottom of what you're arguing here is know who Rawls was, why he was important, and of course what he said. So could you introduce us a bit to that background?
Yeah, so Rawls, for those of you who don't know, is like the towering figure in political philosophy in at least the second half of the 20th century. Probably the whole 20th century. To a certain extent, people say that after Rawls, you have to do political philosophy either with him or against him. Explain why you agree with Rawls or why you disagree with him. And he had very innovative ideas about how to argue for a theory of justice and a theory of political legitimacy for the sort of liberal constitutional democracies we live in. From the very beginning, because of course Animal Liberation was only published 4 years after John Rawls published his first major work, A Theory of Justice, animal ethicists have worried that it's hard to account for animals within a Rawlsian framework of our duties of justice and legitimacy. And there have been several attempts to do that, with some authors like throwing their hands up in the air in despair, concluding that it cannot be done.
On the content of Rawls's theory more precisely, as Eze said, he's worried about how can we build design a theory of justice, develop a theory of justice that can be used in societies like ours, more or less, with broadly liberal commitments. And he's particularly worried, and that's what's most obviously connected to our paper, with how political decisions, especially when they are coercive, but not necessarily, but especially when they're coercive, can be imposed over people who have different beliefs about normative stuff, about moral stuff, political stuff, about religion, and so on, right? People disagree about the right, the good, the holy. The question is, how can we in liberal political societies make decisions that coerce these people when they disagree? And Rawls has this theory that basically says, well, we should appeal to public reasons, which are reasons that all citizens share in virtue of being part of the same political culture, right? They belong to a political community. That political community has some culture, some shared norms, some shared values, and we can appeal to those shared values in order to justify political decisions. Now, as Eze said, in the way Rawls formulated that theory of legitimacy, it's not clear how, if at all, animals can play a role, and we try to see what could be done, if anything, of course.
Well, that leads perfectly to my next question. What can be done?
One strategy that some authors have followed consists in saying, properly interpreted, rules already have enough materials to infer that animals are subjects of duties of justice and legitimacy. We don't need to add anything to Rawlsian theory. It's all already there. And we don't think that works for various reasons. And as we mentioned, all the authors claim, well, there's nothing that can be done, actually, because we cannot infer animals' political standing from Rawlsian materials. And there's nothing we can add to those materials that is consistent with them, which may help us infer animals' political standing. Our take is different. So it's saying it's true that Rawls, as it is, doesn't allow us to ground that we have direct duties of justice and legitimacy towards animals. But there are several important ideas that we can add to his views and which are consistent with the core tenets of Rawlsian political liberalism that can provide us with a framework to ground non-human animals' direct political standing.
So we wanted to find a middle ground, which is always a strategy worth pursuing, I guess. So perhaps just to say something about exactly why there might be a conflict between Rawls's theory and any expansive or inclusive view on animals. So on Rawls's theory, there are certain ideas that he calls fundamental ideas. So one is the idea of society conceived as a scheme of cooperation, social cooperation, that stands over generations, which is constituted by agents that are free and equal. And that's partly or mainly where the conflict seems to arise, because in the way in which Rawls conceives of his theory, it's not clear how animals fit, because it's contested whether they are participants in the scheme of cooperation. And to the extent that they cooperate, they seem to do it through exploitation, which seems like an objectionable way of cooperating. It's not part of what you want to include in your theory of justice or your theory of political legitimacy. And they are also not conceived as free and equal. Even if you think that they are morally equal, they cannot be equal as citizens or as political agents, because they seem to have different capabilities. So as Eze said, some people claim that we can still perfectly incorporate animals within Rawls's theory as he formulated. We're more skeptical, but we think that there are ways of expanding these ideas that I've just mentioned so that they can move in a more sentientist direction, such that they are guided by the value of sentience and not just by ideas of equality and liberty among participants in the social scheme.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In some ways, you are pushing against a lot of the ideas that have come out of animals in political philosophy, the kind of area that you and I work in a big way, because you're quite sympathetic, or at least for the purposes of this paper, you're quite sympathetic with the idea that animals aren't in that kind of same level as humans. They don't cooperate with us, and so they are not entitled to that same basic justice as humans, or at least not in the same way. So why is it you take this different route?
I sometimes worry that this is in part merely a verbal dispute, in that I think we can all agree that human beings with normative cognitive capacities have certain ways of cooperating and participating in politics that all the sentient agents don't, right? So that most human beings have what we call robust political agency. They can give reasons, take reasons, vote, deliberate among each other, hold their representatives accountable, organize in defense of their interests, etc. Whereas at least most non-human animals and some human beings don't have those capacities. And we think that makes a difference, at least from a Rawlsian perspective, on how we have to approach the problem of what we owe them in terms of justice. Rawls approaches the question of what we owe those who can participate in a cooperative system in that way as a matter of what do cooperants owe each other under an idea of fairness as reciprocity. People who have to agree with each other on the rules that distribute the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. Individuals that can make a judgment of whether participating in that kind of system is to their lifelong advantage or not. Those are the problems that these individuals with this particular deliberative and rational capacities are facing. And these problems of justice are different, though perhaps no less important, than the problems of justice that affect the relationships of those individuals with that kind of participatory capacities and other individuals which lack those participatory capacities, but that are nevertheless pervasively, deeply subjected to the same institutional system. So that is the problem of what we owe to those individuals that cannot agree on terms of cooperation with us, but are nevertheless subjected to the institutions that we design. For us, it's very important to stress that even though these are different problems of justice, based on the fact that these are individuals with different agential capacities, in no way that entails that the claims of justice of persons, of those who can participate in the cooperative scheme, have intrinsic greater importance than the claims of justice of sentient beings who exist under a system they cannot cooperate in.
Something that partly motivates our discussion here, which is specific to Rawls, but is that he has a narrow conception of participation in the cooperative scheme that requires, in addition, that participants be able to understand certain public rules and think about them, understand them as norms that they should reciprocate. So he has a narrow and demanding understanding that seems to rule out animals and other beings even on certain conceptions of cooperation. So what we said was, okay, let's take Rawls's framework for a moment and suppose this is the right or the important conception of cooperation. And it seems that it has problems for animals, but it also has a lot of problems incorporating many humans that we think that whether or not they can participate in the scheme in these narrow conceptions, they are still entitled to justice. So we said, well, one way to expand the circle of justice in a way that accommodates our judgments about humans, but then we cannot avoid including animals as well, is by understanding the scheme not merely as a scheme of cooperation, but as a scheme of coexistence, right? And then one could say, but you've so far assumed that Rawls's conception of cooperation is the right one. Why not expand it, as Donaldson, Kimlicka, and many others have suggested? I don't think we are necessarily opposed to that in principle, but what we say something like that is, well, once we have the idea of society as a system of coexistence, we find that sufficiently attractive, whether or not animals are cooperators in some sense, as a basis of Sentientist liberal theory of justice and legitimacy.
Yes, I see. But what's quite interesting is that when we expand our conception of justice to conceive of a system of coexistence, there's still going to be a high degree of humans making decisions for animals, in contrast to, say, Donaldson and Kimlicka, who you just mentioned, who really want to stress the idea of listening to animals.
I would say we totally agree that that's part of what being a diligent trustee for animal entails. That's a phrase we use a lot. We claim that one of the implications of sentientist political liberalism is that when we engage in the public justification of our institutions and policies towards animals, we have a duty of being diligent trustees of them, and that entails certain kind of epistemic duties, if you will. So we have to take seriously the task of gathering the best available evidence of what non-human animals' interests are. And in part, that will require us to listen to them much more than we do now. So I don't think, and we say that explicitly in the paper, that there is a method that will allow us to theorize away the fact that ultimately it is human beings who have to make the political choices for animals, choices about institutional design and public policy. They will not be able to do that for themselves. And when we are engaged in that kind of task, what we have to do is, as I said, gather the best available evidence. That implies avoiding all kinds of epistemic injustice towards animals, performing that task with the right motivation, that is, with the sincere conviction that non-human animals have a good of their own, that grounds strong claims of justice against the basic structure of society, that they deserve a fair share of primary goods to have reasonable lives.
Let me come back to this idea of legitimacy, which is something that has come up a few times in the conversation, because I think this is actually one of the most challenging objections to animal rights, or at least animal rights conceived of in the language of political philosophy. And it goes something like this. It's all well and good to say it's a matter of justice to protect animals, that animals have certain entitlements of justice. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is, what is it that allows the state to force people to respect those duties of justice, rather than just leaving people to respect them as they see fit? And if we're serious about animal rights, then we're serious about something like, I would say, the state being able to force people to respect animals. So, all of that said, how does sentientist political liberalism help us respond to this worry about legitimacy?
That's a great question, because kind of what motivated Eze and I to write this paper, and as we'll say later, the work that we are engaged right now is this way, right? It seems that we may have very good arguments to say that we have some duties of justice towards animals, but it's a deep conviction within liberal societies that something, just because it's just, cannot simply be enforced, And not everything that can be enforced need to be just. So sometimes states have at least the permission, can, under some circumstances, make some decisions that are not fully just. So that's why we were drawn to this question of legitimacy. And there's some ideas behind political liberalism of any kind, but for Rawlsian specifically, that we found attractive. One was the fact that it seems that unless decisions are made in a way that citizens can make their own or can connect to their values, it does seem that you'll get much done because you'll face lots of resistance. So that seems like kind of a recipe for anarchy or like rebellion if you try to make decisions that your citizens repeatedly do not understand or are unable to see as having reason to do. So we were moved by this concern. And a second concern that seems to motivate political liberalism in general is the idea that persons have a claim against being imposed certain decisions that they cannot honestly see themselves as having reason to do. This may not be an absolute claim, all claims have limits, but it seems important to us. And as we'll see later, we don't want to be like so constrained by the Rawlsian apparatus, but because it's the most developed framework that we have so far, it was worth starting with it. And the Rawlsian idea is that, well, as I just mentioned earlier, we should appeal to public reasons that are part of the political culture. And that's where Eze and I try to jump in and say, well, one way in which we could integrate animals here is by having a political culture that is sentientist, that takes sentience as at least one ground of moral obligations, of moral duties, which, of course, current societies lack. And that's what we try to do in the final part of this paper, is precisely to argue how we might move society in a more sentientist direction so that we can develop this sentientist political culture and can make decisions that are justified to all citizens.
Yeah, if we are convinced by sentientist political liberalism, our claim is that what follows is that we have a duty to try and change the public political culture in our society so that it contains those materials that allow us to construct just, stable, sentientist institutions. And our claim is that if we sincerely believe that we can transition from a non-sentientist to a sentientist society by simply articulating pre-existing ideas in that political culture, that's what we have to do. But it might be the case that we conclude that is not possible. There are not enough materials in our political culture to transition in that sentientist direction. And then we noticed, reading Rawls's political liberalism, that he addresses a similar problem, the problem of how do we transition from a slave society like that in the southern United States to a liberal society when there are not enough materials there. And what Rawls says, well, in that case, in order to create a politically liberal society in which the demands of liberal public justification can be honored, it might be temporarily necessary to argue for those materials from our comprehensive ethical doctrines or comprehensive religious doctrines. And so we say the same regarding our duties to go into transition to a sentientist society. If our current societies don't have enough materials, it might be permissible, even on the principles of political liberalism itself, to argue temporarily from a comprehensive ethical view to try and make that social change.
Perhaps here an example might be useful, because that's what Rawls himself was concerned. So he was concerned about Martin Luther King. He said, well, we had, as I said, like segregation, at some point slavery, but then segregation in the south of the US, and we have these abolitionist groups and later these anti-segregation groups who are highly Christian groups, and they appeal to religious doctrine, which, of course, many people in liberal societies do not share at all. But Rawls didn't want to say that Martin Luther King, for instance, was saying or doing things that were illegitimate in a liberal society. So he said, well, one way to make room for the kind of activism that people like Martin Luther King did was precisely what Eze suggested. Depends on the possibilities of changing the culture and how unjust the present culture is and so on and so forth. And we try to argue that something like that applies in the case of animals, such that for some stages we may be able to appeal to some doctrines that are not fully shared so that we can transform the political culture and then justify decisions in a public way.
I've asked a couple of questions about how this proposal relates to others in the animal ethics, animal rights world. But I suppose the other side of this question, the other side of this conversation, is how Rawlsians are going to take this. Rawls himself has been dead for a number of years, of course. I believe he was a vegetarian, but he certainly wasn't someone who we would think of as an animal rights theorist. And lots of contemporary Rawlsians, and there are many of them, are not particularly animal friendly. So how have you had any response from Rawlsians, or how do you anticipate that Rawlsians are going to take these proposals? Because they're quite revisionary.
There are a couple of Rawlsians to whom we have discussed our ideas, and they were quite sympathetic to them. And actually it was one of those, Andrew Williams, a professor at our university. He was convinced that it was wrong to claim that Rawlsian theory is incompatible with animals' direct political standing. He was convinced that there were things that could be done to supplement that theory in ways that were consistent with Rawls's other views. So we tried to follow on that thought. And it's true that all the Rawlsians that we have spoken to were quite already animal friendly. So we haven't confronted perhaps our staunchest adversaries yet.
Totally right. So I think initially this paper was much more militant against Rawls. We called the first version of this paper Animals in Rawlsian Political Philosophy, Integration, Accommodation, and Conflict, or something like that, which were 3 strategies, and we defended conflict. But yes, Andrew Williams said, well, maybe it's a mistake to say that Rawls was committed to any views on animals. Maybe it's better to say that he just, for the purposes of his own theory, idealized animals away, or his theory was incomplete in a way that could be expanded. So maybe there was room for a kind of more animal-inclusive expansion that didn't necessarily conflict with Rawls, but just expanded it, and that's what we tried to do in this paper.
Now, there's a big part of me that would like to continue this conversation for another 3 or 4 hours, but I realise that we should probably try to keep it somewhat constrained and move on to our regular questions. Now, because there's 2 of you, and because, Eze, you've been on the podcast before, I suggest that we offer the 5 questions, the 5 regular questions, to Pablo. So, Pablo, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So it's hard to tell, but I'm pretty sure that the first piece that I read from beginning to end was by a Spanish philosopher who passed away a few years ago called Jesus Mosterin. So he wrote this book called The Triumph of Compassion. He was even in favor of eating animals, but still, for the purposes of the landscape at the moment, he had like quite progressive views on animals. I think that was my first acquaintance with these arguments, at least in some level of simplicity, which was what I needed at the moment.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I think it's probably an essay that I wrote when I was doing my master's in political philosophy at Pompeu University, and I wrote something on how theories of democracy, the authority of democracy, should include animals, and why animals should be included according to the all-affected interest principle that I later developed. And I think that the first time that I thought about these ideas and wrote something completely half-baked was there.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So that's going to sound extremely fake, but I'm going to elaborate because my answer is Eze, and I will explain why. So I've known Eze for more than 20 years because he's the brother of a very close friend from childhood. So that meant that we were friends on Facebook for many years, especially 12 years ago when something happened in my life, which is that both my parents and I bought a dog. So if I bought a dog, imagine that my views on animals were very different from those I have now. But living with an animal for the first time and through reasons that are not completely transparent to me, I started to rethink the way I thought about animals. It's not that my dog was doing much; he was just sleeping and licking his dog parts. But I rethought the way I thought about animals, and I was in a vulnerable spot. And at that point, Eze was sharing a lot of stuff on animals on Facebook, and because I was quite receptive, I think that opened the door for everything that came later, right? So there was Peter Singer, there was Kim Lica, there was Donaldson, but everything that came later was because that first door opened. So I think that objectively speaking, much, if anything, of what came later wouldn't have come. So I think that's what was most impactful because it was right at the beginning. I would also count my dog, but I wouldn't say he's an animal scholar.
That's interesting. We've had this conversation a few times on Knowing Animals about whether animals could be considered scholars or authors or influences. We've never quite got to an answer, but yes, I think that's a great answer to the question. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I'm pretty in favor of a division of labor. I think it's fine that some people are working on ideal theories for the long term of what kind of societies would like to live in where the relationships between humans and non-humans are just. And I think it's also important that some people are doing some stuff that it's much more non-ideal and can be more easily used to persuade people and, well, hopefully address them in a way that they can find interesting or moving. So I think that we can, at great level of generality, we can question misconceptions and bad arguments about animals' moral status in different degrees of ambitiousness, depending on whether we want to formulate a ideal model of society or something that is transitional or non-ideal. So I'm happy with people doing both kinds of work.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I mean, I want to say something concrete other than the disappearance of exploitation or something like that. So I would say that the disappearance of the belief that species membership in itself is morally significant.
What is it you're working on next?
Right now, my present position finishes in September, so I'm applying to new postdocs, and this requires developing a project. So what I want to focus and work on is theory of legitimacy for interspecies societies, that it's pluralistic. I think that the most plausible theory of legitimacy, at least for me, must include different elements, some of which have to do with peaceful cooperation, some of which have to do with public justification, but also some element of interest protection. So that's, in the long run, what I plan to work on. In the short term, I'm right now working with Eze on a book that we have under contract with Cambridge University Press on a Cambridge Elements on basically the political turn, which we hope it will allow us to test some of the ideas here. And with another colleague of us, Adrián Moret, who works on AI, we are writing a paper on the claims of sentient beings to AI governance. So he's the AI guy. I mean, he knows about animals, but he knows a lot about AI. And Eze and I are kind of introducing the liberal framework in the paper.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I would say basically through my website. I never know the name because I'm using one of these Google sites, which is part of the name of the website. But if you Google me, you should find me on hopefully on top of the results.
I'll ask those two final questions to Eze as well. So what is it you're working on next, Eze?
Okay, so Pablo already mentioned our Cambridge Elements and paper on the political claims of non-human sentience to AI governance. So in that paper, we use the Sentientist political liberalism as a framework, and that thing has given us confidence on the fruitfulness of the theory. So our major goal now is to write a book on political liberalism and all the sentient beings or potential sentient beings at the margins of our moral concern. Animals, AI systems, and future generations. So now we just need a major publisher to accept the proposal. On the other hand, I just finished a first draft of a weird paper where I defend what I called Republican animal liberation. So it's the idea that if we are consistent act-utilitarians, we have to internalize a very strict rights-based deontological code for our treatment of animals and adopt broadly Republican ideal regarding how political institutions that protect animals ought to be designed. So I'm trying to make all my different views consistent in some way. And I'm also working on a book chapter on legal violence and animals for a collective volume. So we usually see the law as restricting our capacity for violence, but at the same time, actually, the legal system condones and sometimes requires of us acts of violence. And that's especially true in the case of animals. And my chapter is about the kinds of violence against animals that are admissible under Spanish law.
And how can people find out more about your work?
So easy. You can go to ezepaez.com and of course my Google Scholar profile.
Well, thanks so much, Eze, for joining us this podcast.
Again, a pleasure to be here.
And thanks, Pablo, for joining us.
Really honored.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can find us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X or on Instagram or on Blue Sky or on LinkedIn, all over the place. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.